Station EV13 presents Owls in the Family by Farley Mowat. Been reading a book of facts. I found one here. An average person spends about 20,160 minutes of their life kissing. Well, I'm all alone on a space station book. Sorry to throw off the curve. Anyway, my book today is going to be Owls in the Family by Farley Mowat. It's a wonderful book. Of course, it's set several years in the past. It was published in 1961, but it was also loosely based on Mowat's own childhood. And since he's mentioning like a Model A Ford in the book, we can assume that it's around 1930. So it might seem like the book's from a different time, but that's because it really is. So you'll hear him use words like Indian when he's referring to indigenous peoples of Canada. Or, really casually talking about stealing eggs and hunting for animals and keeping wild animals as pets. Obviously, it's something that we shouldn't do. Wild animals should be wild, and saving animals, although noble, should be, left to professionals who know how to take care of animals properly. That being said, support your local rescue, or any rescue. Support helping animals. Yeah. Speaking of animals, I've been programming a cat to, keep me company. Not exactly cuddly, and I accidentally programmed it French somehow. I didn't even know I could do that. Trying to change it around, and Das Meow! German. Alright. Anyway, I'll fiddle with that later. No big deal. Back when I was growing up, I used to read a comic written by Lynn Johnson, another Canadian, called For Better or For Worse. And in the comic, when I was a kid, there was a dog named Farley named after Farley Mowat. And I always loved that I got that reference. For Better or For Worse was one of the rare comics that actually grew up with you. The characters actually aged. Parents became grandparents, children become grown-ups, and parents in their own right. An old favorite. I really hope you enjoyed the book. I remember it being one of my favorites when I was a kid. And, enjoy. Chapter 1. One May morning, my friend Bruce and I went for a hike on the prairie. Spring was late that year in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Snowdrifts still clung along the steep banks of the river in the shelter of the cottonwood trees. The river was icy with thaw water, and as we crossed over the railroad bridge, we could feel a cold breath rising from it. But we felt another breath, a gentle one, blowing across the distant wheat fields and smelling like warm sun shining on the soft mud. It was the spring wind, and the smell of it made us walk faster. We were in a hurry to get out of the city and into the real prairie, where you can climb a fence post and see for about 1,000,000 miles. That's how flat the prairie is. The great thing about Saskatoon was the way it ended sharp, all around the edge. There were no outskirts to Saskatoon. When you stepped off the end of the railroad bridge, you stepped right onto the prairie, and there you were, free as the gophers. Gophers were the commonest thing on the prairie. The little mounds of yellow dirt around their burrows were so thick sometimes, it looked as if the fields had yellow measles. But this day, Bruce and I weren't interested in the gophers. We were looking for an owl's nest. We had decided that we wanted some pet owls. And if you want pet owls, you have to find a nest and get the young ones out of it. We headed for the nearest of the clumps of cottonwood trees that dot the prairies, and which are called bluffs out in Saskatchewan. The ground was spongy under our sneakers, and is squooshed when we hit a wet place. A big jackrabbit bounced up right under my feet and scared me so much I jumped almost as high as he did. And as we came nearer the bluff, 2 crows came zooming out of it and swooped down on us, cawing their heads off. Bluffs are funny places in the spring. The cottonwood trees shed a kind of white fluffy stuff that looked like snow. Sometimes it's so thick it comes right over the top of your sneakers, and you get a queer feeling that you really are walking through snow. even though the sun on your back is making you sweat right through your shirt. We walked through this bluff, scuffing our feet in the cottonwood snow and stirring it up in clouds. We kept looking up, and after a while, sure enough, we saw a big mess of twigs high up in a poplar. "All right," Bruce said to the two crows, which was swooping and hollering at us. "If you want me to snitch your eggs, I will." With that, he handed me his haversack and began to shinny up the tree. It was an easy climb because cottonwood poplars always have lots of branches. When he got to the nest and looked into it, I yelled up at him, "Any eggs?" Bruce grinned, but he wouldn't answer. I could see him doing something with his free hand, the one he wasn't holding on with. And I knew there were eggs there all right. I watched, and sure enough, he was popping them into his mouth so he could carry them down out of the tree. We always carried eggs down out of trees this way. The only thing was, crow's eggs are pretty big, and if you have to stuff 3 or 4 of them into your mouth, it nearly chokes you. Bruce started to climb down. When he got about 10 feet from the ground, he stepped on a rotten branch. Poplar branches are always rotten near the ground, and you have to watch out for them. I guess Bruce forgot. Anyway, the branch broke, and he slid the rest of the way, and lit on his seat with a good hard bump. All the eggs had broken, and Bruce was spitting out shells and eggs all over the cottonwood snow. I got laughing so hard I couldn't even talk. When Bruce got most of the eggs spat out, he came for me and tackled me, and we had a fight. It didn't last long because it was too hot to really fight, so Bruce ate a sardine sandwich to get the taste of crow's eggs out of his mouth, and then we started across the prairie again, and searched through other bluffs till we found an owl's nest. I guess we searched about 100 bluffs that morning, but we never saw an owl. We were getting hungry by then, so we made a sort of nest for ourselves on the ground, out of poplar snow and branches. We curled up in it and opened our haversacks. Bruce had sandwiches and a lemon in his. He was the only boy I ever knew who liked to eat lemons. He said they were better than oranges any day of the week. I had a hard-boiled egg, and just for fun, I reached over and cracked the shell on Bruce's head. He yelled, and we had another fight, and we rolled all over his sardine sandwiches. We were just finishing our lunch when a wood gopher came snuffling along through the cottonwood snow. Wood gophers are gray and have big, bushy tails. This one came right up to us, and when I held a crust out to him, he shuffled up and took it out of my hand. "Got no sense," said Bruce. "You might have been a coyote, and then where he'd be at." "Heck," I said. "He's got more sense than you. Do I look like a coyote?" The gopher didn't say anything. He just took the crust and scuttled away to his hole somewhere. We picked up our haversacks. The sun was as bright as fireworks, and the sky was so clear you could look right through it, like looking through a blue window. We started to walk. All of a sudden, Bruce stopped so fast that I bumped into him. "Look-ee," he said, and pointed to a bluff about half a mile away. There must have been 1,000,000 crows around it. It looked as if the bluff was on fire and filling the sky with black smoke. That's how many crows there were. When you see a bunch of crows all yelling their heads off at something, you can almost bet it's an owl they're after. Crows and owls hate each other, and when a crow spots an owl, he'll carry every other crow for miles, and they all join in and mob the owl. We headed for that bluff at a run. The crows saw us coming, but they were too excited to pay much attention. We were nearly deaf with their racket by the time we reached the edge of the trees. I was ahead of Bruce when I saw something big and slow go drifting out of one poplar into another. It was a great horned owl, the biggest kind of owl there is, and as soon as it flew, the whole lot of crows came swooping down on it, cawing like fury. I noticed they were careful not to get too close. Bruce and I started to hunt for the nest. After a while, the owl got more worried about us than about the crows, and away he went. He flew low over the fields, almost touching the ground. That way the crows couldn't dive on him. If they tried it, they would shoot past him and crash into the dirt. There wasn't any owl's nest in that bluff after all, but we didn't worry. We knew the nest would have to be in some bluff not too far away. All we had to do was look. We looked in different bluffs all afternoon. We found 7 crow's nests, a red-tailed hawk nest, and 3 magpies' nests. I tore the seat out of my trousers climbing to the hawk's nest, and we both got Russian thistles in our sneakers, so we had sore feet. It got hotter and hotter, and we were so thirsty I could have eaten a lemon myself, except that Bruce didn't have any more. It was past supper time when we started back towards the railroad. By then we were pretending we were a couple of Arabs lost in the desert. Our camels had died of thirst, and we were going to die too, unless we found some water pretty soon. "Listen," Bruce said. "There's an old well at Halton Corner. If we cut over past Barney's Slough to the section road, we can get a drink." "Too late," I told him. "Goodbye, old pal, old sheik. I am doomed. Go on and leave me lay." "Ah, nuts," said Bruce. "I'm thirsty. Come on, let's go." So we cut past Barney's Slough, and there were about 1,000 mallard ducks on it. They all jumped into the air as we went by, and their wings made a sound like a freight train going over a bridge. "Wish I had my dad's gun," said Bruce. But I was wondering why on the prairies they called lakes and ponds sloughs. I still don't know why. But that's what they're called in Saskatoon. There was one big bluff between us and Halton Corner. It was too far to go around it, so we walked right through it. Anyway, it was cooler in among the trees. When we were about halfway through, I spotted a crow's nest in a big old cottonwood. "Bet it's empty," I said to Bruce. But the truth was that I was just too hot and tired to climb any more trees. Bruce felt the same way, and we walked past. But I took one last look up at it, and there, sticking over the edge of the nest, was the biggest bunch of tail feathers you ever saw. My heart jumped right into my throat, and I grabbed Bruce by the shirt and pointed up. It was a great horned owl, all right. We kept as quiet as we could, so as not to scare her. And then we looked around the bottom of the tree. There were bits of rabbits and gophers and lots of owl pellets. When owls catch something, they eat the whole thing, bones, fur, and all. Then after a while, they burp and spit out a ball of hair and bones. That's an owl pellet. "By gang, we found it," Bruce whispered. "I found it," I said. "Okay," said Bruce, "you found it then. So how about you climbing up and seeing how many young ones are in it?" "Nothing doing, old pal," I replied. "I found the nest. So if you want one of the owlets, you climb up and have a look." Neither of us was keen to climb that tree. The old owl was sticking close to her nest, and you can't always tell how fierce an owl is going to be. They can be pretty fierce sometimes. "Say," said Bruce after a while, "why don't we just leave her here for now? Might scare her into leaving the nest for good if we climbed up. Let's say we get Mr. Miller and come back tomorrow." Mr. Miller was one of our teachers. Bruce and I liked him because he liked the prairie too. He was a great one for taking pictures of birds and things. We knew he would be crazy to get some pictures of the owl, and Mr. Miller never minded climbing trees. "Sure," I said, "good idea." We went off to Halton Corner and got a drink of water that tasted like old nails out of the broken pump. Then we walked on home. That night I told Dad about the owl's nest, and he looked at his mother and all he said was, "Oh no, not owls too." Chapter 2. The reason Dad said, "Oh no, not owls too," was because I already had some pets. There was a summer house in our backyard, and we kept about 30 gophers in it. They belonged to Bruce and me, and to another boy called Murray. We caught them out in the prairie using snares made of heavy twine. The way you do it is like this. You walk along until you spot a gopher sitting up beside his hole. Gophers sit straight up, reaching their noses as high as they can so they can see further. When you begin to get too close, they flick their tails, give a little jump, and whisk down their holes. As soon as they do that, you take a piece of twine that has a noose tied on one end, and you spread the noose over the hole. Then you lie down in the grass, holding the other end of the twine in your hand. You can hear the gopher all the while, whistling away to itself somewhere underground. He can hear you too, and he's wondering what you're up to. After a while, he gets so curious he can't stand it. He pops out his head, and you give a yank on the twine. You have to haul it in fast, because if the twine gets loose, he'll slip his head out of the noose and zip back down his hole. We had rats, too. Murray's dad was a professor at the university, so we got us some white rats from the medical school. We kept them in our garage, which made my dad a little peeved because he couldn't put the car in the garage for fear the rats would make nests inside the seats. Nobody ever knew how many rats we had because they have so many babies, and they have them so fast. We gave white rats away to all the kids in Saskatoon, but we always seemed to end up with as many as we had at first. There were the rats and gophers, and then there was a big cardboard box full of garter snakes that we kept under the back porch, because my mother wouldn't let me keep them in the house. And then there were the pigeons. I usually had about 10 of them, but they kept bringing their friends and relations for visits, so I never knew how many to expect when I went out to feed them in the mornings. And then there was Mutt, my dog, but he wasn't a pet, he was one of the family. Sunday morning, my father said, "Billy, I think you have enough pets. I don't think you'd better bring home any owls. In any case, the owls might eat your rats and rabbits and gophers." He stopped talking and a queer look came over his face. Then he said, "On second thought, maybe we need an owl around this place." So it was all right. Sunday afternoon, Bruce and I met Mr. Hiller at his house. He was a big man with a bald head. He wore short pants and carried a great big haversack full of cameras and films. He was excited about the owl's nest, all right, and he was in such a hurry to get to it that Bruce and I had to run most of the way just to keep up with him. When we reached the edge of the owl bluff, Mr. Miller got out his biggest camera, and after he had fussed with it for about half an hour, he said he was ready. "We'll walk Indian file, boys," he said, "and quiet as mice, tiptoe. Mustn't scare the owl away." Well, that sounded all right, only you can't walk quietly in a poplar bluff because of all the dead sticks underfoot. They crack and pop like firecrackers. Under Mr. Miller's feet, they sounded like cannon shots. Anyway, when we got to the nest tree, there was no sign of the owl. "Are you sure this is an owl's nest?" Mr. Miller asked us. "Yes, sir," Bruce answered. "We seen the owl sitting on it." Mr. Miller shuddered. "Saw the owl sitting on it, Bruce." Well, I suppose I'd better climb up and take a peek, but if you ask me, I think it's just an old crow's nest. He put down his big haversack and the camera, and up he went. He was wearing a big floppy hat to keep his head from getting sunburned, and I don't think he could see out from under it very well. "Boy, he's got knobbly knees," Bruce whispered to me. We both started to giggle, and we were still giggling when Mr. Miller began to shout. "Hoy ye!" he yelled. "Scat! Ooh-ee! Oi! Oi!" Bruce and I ran around the other side of the tree so we could see up to the nest. Mr. Miller was hanging onto the tree with both arms, and he was kicking out with his feet. It looked as if his feet had slipped off the branch and couldn't find a place to get a hold of again. Just then there was a swooshing sound, and the old owl came diving right down on top of him with her wings spread wide. She looked as big as a house, and she didn't miss Mr. Miller by more than an inch. Then she swooped up and away again. Mr. Miller was yelling some strange things, and good and loud, too. He finally got one foot back on a branch, but he was in such a hurry to get down that he picked too small a branch. It broke, and he slid about 5 feet before his belt caught on his stub. While he was trying to get loose, the owl came back for another try. This time she was so close that I could see her big yellow eyes, and both Bruce and I ducked. She had her claws stuck way out in front of her. Just as she dived towards him, Mr. Miller, who couldn't see her coming because of his hat, gave a jump upward to get free of the stub. The result was that the owl couldn't miss him even if she wanted to. There was an awful flapping and yelling, and then away went the owl with Mr. Miller's hat. I don't think she really wanted that old hat. It was all Mr. Miller's fault for jumping at the wrong time. The owl seemed to be trying to shake the hat loose from her claws, but she couldn't because her claws were hooked in it. The last we saw of her, she was flying out over the prairie, and she still had the hat. When Mr. Miller got down out of the tree, he went right to his haversack. He took out a bottle, opened it, and started to drink. His Adam's apple was going in and out like an accordion. After a while, he put down the bottle and wiped his mouth. When he saw us staring at him, he tried to smile. "Cold tea," he explained. "Thirsty work climbing trees in this hot weather." "It was an owl's nest, wasn't it, sir?" asked Bruce. Mr. Miller looked at him hard for a moment. Then, "Yes, Bruce," he said, "I guess it was." There was one thing about Mr. Miller. You couldn't stop him for long. Now he explained to us that it was probably a bad thing to climb to the nest because it would disturb the owls too much. He had a better idea. He took a hatchet out of his haversack, and we set to work building something that he called a blind. What this was really was a little tent fixed on a platform out of sticks high up in another tree, but close to the owl tree. It took a couple of hours to build the blind. Bruce and I went scrounging for pieces of wood, and when we brought them back, Mr. Miller hauled them up the chosen tree with a rope and nailed them into place. When he had a platform built, he hauled up the tent. The tent had a round hole as big as your fist in front of it. That was for the camera. According to Mr. Miller, you could hide in the blind and stay there until the owl thought everything was safe. Then, when the owl came back to her nest, you could take all the pictures you wanted, and she would never even know about it. You sure must think owls are dumb, Bruce muttered to me when Mr. Miller wasn't near. She may not see him, but she could see that tent if her eyes were tight shut, and I don't think she's going to like it. When the blind was finished, Mr. Miller said he was ready to try it. You boys go off for a walk, he told us. Make a lot of noise when you're leaving. The books say birds can't count, so the owl will think all three of us have gone, and she'll never guess I've stayed up here in the blind. Okay, Mr. Miller, I said. Come on, Brucey, let's get going. We walked about a mile away to the little slough and started looking for red-winged blackbirds' nests. It was another nice day, and we forgot about Mr. Miller until we began to get hungry. Then we went back to the bluff. Mr. Miller was on the ground. He had just finished the rest of his cold tea, but he didn't look the least bit well. His face was awfully white, and his hands were shaking as he tried to put his camera away. The camera looked as if it had fallen out of the tree. It was all scratched and covered with dirt. Get some good pictures, sir? I asked him cheerfully. No, I didn't, Mr. Miller said, and it was sort of a snarl. But I'll tell you one thing. Any blame fool who says owls can't count is a liar. On the way home, Mr. Miller finally told us what had happened. About an hour after we went walking, the owl came back. She lit on her nest, and she turned around and took a good long look at the little tent, which was on a level with her, and only about 6 feet away. Mr. Miller was busy inside the tent, focusing his camera and getting ready to take the owl's picture, when she asked, "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo," and took one leap. The next thing Mr. Miller knew, the front was ripped right out of the tent, and the owl was looking him in the eye from about a foot away. Mr. Miller accidentally dropped his camera, and then, of course, he had to hurry down to see if it was all right. And that was when we got back to the bluff. I guess it wasn't a very good day for Mr. Miller, but it wasn't too bad for us. Mr. Miller said he had seen 3 young owls in the nest, and he thought they were about halfway grown, which meant they were about the right age to take home for pets. All we had to do now was figure out some way to get a hold of them. Chapter 3. The next week seemed awfully long. The only time I really hated school was during the springtime, particularly in May when the birds were busy nesting on the prairies. This May week, what with thinking about the owls and sitting by the open window sniffing the smells of springtime, I wish school had never been invented. Every recess and after school, Murray and Bruce and I talked about the young owls and tried to think of ways to get them out of their nest. Murray suggested we should cut down the tree, but that was too dangerous because the young owls might get hurt. Bruce said he might get his father to come out and shoot the old owl so it would be safe for us to climb the tree, but that wasn't fair. The only thing I could think of was firecrackers. My idea was to get some small skyrockets and let them off under the nest to scare the mother owl away. The trouble was that we had no money, and anyway, the storekeepers wouldn't sell skyrockets to kids our age. Then, on Friday night, we had a storm of the kind called a Chinook. Chinooks come down out of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, and sometimes they blow right across Saskatchewan, and they blow like a fury. Lying on my bed on Friday night, I could hear the branches snapping off the poplar trees across the riverbank. The rain was pelting on the roof so hard that it scared Mutt, who always slept on my bed, and made him howl. I had to pull a quilt over his head to make him keep quiet. He hated storms. I worried about the young owls for a long time before I finally fell asleep. Early on Saturday morning, Murray called for me, and we met Bruce at the railroad bridge. It was a fine morning, and the sun kept popping in and out between the white clouds that were racing across the sky trying to catch up to the Chinook. Everything was steaming from all the rain, and the prairie was soggy wet. We hurried across the fields and didn't care if our feet did get soaked, because we were worried about the owls. And we were still quite away from the owl bluff, Bruce gave a shout. "Looky," he yelled. "Old Miller's blind is gone." Sure enough, 6 or 7 of the biggest cottonwoods were snapped right off at the tops, and as for Mr. Miller's blind, it had been blown clean out of its tree, and nobody ever did find it again. But the worst thing was the owl's nest. The rain and wind had smashed it to pieces, and all that was left was a stick or two stuck in the crotch where the nest had been. There was no sign of the old owls at all, but on the ground near the foot of the tree were 2 young owls, and they were cold and dead. They were so young they had grown only about half their feathers, and baby down was still sticking to them all over. I don't know whether they were killed by the fall or not, but they were as wet as sponges, and I think they probably died from being so wet and cold all night long. We felt as miserable as could be, and all we could think of to do was have a funeral for the little owls. Bruce had his jackknife with him, and he started to dig a grave while Mary and I went looking for the right kind of sticks to use for crosses. There was a big pile of brush nearby, and I happened to give it a kick in passing. Something went snap, snap, snap from under it. I shoved my hand under the brush and touched a bundle of wet feathers. Bruce and Murray came over, and we pulled the brush away. There was the missing owlet, the 3rd one that had been in the nest, and he was still alive. He was bigger than the other 2, and that was probably because he was the first one hatched. Horned owls are funny that way. They begin to lay their eggs in March when it's still winter on the prairie. The eggs are laid a few days apart, but from the time the first one is laid, the mother has to start setting. If she waited till she had a full clutch of eggs, the early ones would be chilled and would never hatch. The first egg that's laid hatches first, and that young owl gets a 4 or 5 day head start on the next one, who in turn gets a head start on the next one. The one we found must have been the first to hatch because he was not only bigger than the others, but he must have been stronger too. When the nest blew apart and he fell to the ground, he was able to wiggle under the brush pile for shelter, and that probably saved his life. He was about as big as a chicken, and you could see his grown-up feathers pushing through the baby down. He even had the beginnings of the 2 horn feathers growing on the top of his head. A surprising thing about him was that he was almost pure white, with only small black markings on the ends of his feathers. When we found him, he looked completely miserable, because all his down and feathers were stuck together in clumps, and he was shivering like a leaf. I thought he would be too miserable to feel like fighting, but when I tried to pick him up, he hunched forward, spread his wings, and hissed at me. It was a good try, but he was too weak to keep it up, and he fell right over on his face. I was still a little bit afraid of him because his claws were long and sharp, and his beak, which he kept snapping, seemed big enough to bite off my finger. But he did look so wet and sad that after a while I stopped being afraid. I got down on my knees in front of him and very slowly put my hand on his back. He hunched down as if he thought I was going to hurt him. But when I didn't hurt, he stopped hissing and lay still. He felt as cold as ice. I took off my shirt and put it over him. And then I picked him up as carefully as I could and carried him out of the bluff so he could sit in the sunshine and get dry and warm again. It was surprising how fast he started to get better. In half an hour his feathers were dry and he was standing up and looking around him. Murray had brought along some roast beef sandwiches for lunch. He took some meat out of the sandwiches and held it out to the owl. The owl looked at him a minute, with his head to one side. Then it gave a funny little hop and came close enough to snatch the meat out of Murray's fingers. It gave a couple of gulps, blinked its eyes once, and the meat was gone. He was certainly a hungry owl. He ate all the meat we had, and most of the bread as well. When I found some dead mice that his mother must have left on the edge of the nest, which had also been blown to the ground, the owl ate them too. They must have been hard to swallow because he ate them whole, but he got them down somehow. After that, we were friends. When Bruce and I started to walk away from him just to see what he would do, the owl followed right along behind us like a dog. He couldn't fly, of course, and he couldn't walk any too well either. He kind of jumped along, but he stayed right with us all the same. I think he knew he was an orphan, and that if he stayed with us, we'd look after him. When I sat down again, he came up beside me, and after taking a sideways look into my face, he hopped up on my leg. I was afraid his claws would go right through my skin, but they didn't hurt at all. He was being very careful. "Guess he's your owl, all right," Bruce said, and I could see he was a little jealous. "No, sir, Bruce," I replied. "He can live at my place, but he's going to be our owl, all three of us." We left him sitting in the sun by the haversacks, and then we buried the other two little owls and had a funeral over them. After that, we were ready to go home. We decided the best way to carry our new pet was to put him in my haversack. He didn't like it much, but after a struggle, we managed to stuff him into it. We left his head sticking out so we could see where he was going. Mutt and Bruce's dog, Rex, hadn't been with us that morning. I think the two of them had gone off cat hunting before we got up. But as we were walking along the sidewalk in front of my house, we met old Mutt coming back from wherever he'd been. Mutt was cross-eyed and short-sighted, and so he never could see any too well. He came up to me to say hello, wagging his long tail and sniffing me, and then suddenly he smelled owl. I don't think he knew exactly what it was he smelled, because he had never been so close to an owl before, but he knew he smelled something strange. I stood there trying not to laugh while he sniffed all around me. He snuffed my trousers, and then he began to sniff the haversack. When his nose was nearly in the owl's face, the bird opened its beak and snapped it shut again, right on the end of poor old Mutt's black nose. Mutt gave a yelp you could have heard a mile away, and went loping off to hide his hurt feelings under the garage. We put the owl in the summer house, and when Dad got home from work, the owl was sitting on an orange crate watching the gophers running around on the floor below him. It kept him busy. His head kept turning one way and the other, until it looked as if it were going to unscrew right off his shoulders. He didn't know what to make of the gophers, because he had never seen a live one before. But he was certainly interested in them. "Better catch your gophers, Billy," said my father. "I have an idea they may start disappearing. By the way, what do you call your owl?" I hadn't thought of any name for him up until that moment, but now one just popped into my head. I remembered Christopher Robin's owl in Winnie the Pooh. "His name is Wool," I said, and Wool he was, forever after. Chapter 4. I woke up early on Sunday morning, while everyone else in the house was still asleep. I sneaked downstairs in my pajamas and went out into the backyard to see how Wool was getting along. The grass was still wet with dew, and it was cold and slippery under my bare feet. I peeked through the screen in the summer house, but for a while I couldn't see Wool. He had got down from his orange crate and was standing in the shadows on the floor. There wasn't a single gopher in sight, and I had an awful moment as I wondered if he had eaten a lot of them. Then I realized this was silly. There had been 30 gophers, and he was only one small owl. Wool didn't see me. He seemed fascinated by a pile of old sacks lying in a corner, and as I watched, he made a hop and a skip and jumped up on top of the sacks. Then we both found out where the gophers were. I never saw so many gophers move so fast. They came shooting out from under the sacks like bullets, and then went crazily bouncing from side to side of the summer house looking for some new place to hide. I guessed what happened. Wool must have been feeling lonely, so he decided to make friends with the gophers. But if Wool didn't know anything about gophers, the gophers knew all about owls. When he plopped down among them, they must have run for shelter under those sacks as if the devil himself was after them. Now that Wool had accidentally, or was it on purpose, chased them out to the open again, they went mad. One big fellow came zooming against the wall, bouncing off it, and ran headlong into Wool. Wool jumped, fluffed his feathers, and gave a surprised little hoot. The gopher probably thought his last moment had come. But anyway, he wasn't going to die like a coward, so he bit Wool on the leg. Wool exploded. One minute he was on the floor, and the next he was clinging upside down to the screening at the top of the summer house. He was scared to death. I don't think anything in the world could have persuaded him to go back down there among those bouncing, biting gophers. I went into the summer house and untangled Wool from the screening and took him outside. He was so glad to see me that he started to hoot and couldn't stop. It was like hiccups. I couldn't put him back with the gophers, so I tucked him under my arm, tiptoed back into the house, and upstairs to my room. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor, right up under the roof. Nobody ever came up there except me and the maid, whose name was Ophelia. We always called her Ophi, who made my bed and tried to dust the room. I knew perfectly well Mother would never allow me to keep Wool in the house, but I was pretty sure that if I could just keep him locked in my room and hide him under the bed when Ophi was due, nobody would know. When I went downstairs for breakfast about an hour later, I left Wool sitting on the back of the chair acting quite at home. I thought I closed the door tight, but the latch must have slipped. Dad and I had breakfast together, but Mother wasn't feeling well that day, so she decided to have hers in bed. After Ophi had brought me my porridge, she went into the kitchen and got a breakfast tray ready for Mother. Ophi was an odd sort of girl. She used to have queer dreams. She claimed she used to see angels and things in her dreams. Sometimes she saw them when she was supposed to be wide awake. But she was a good cook, and so Dad and Mother never bothered much about things she claimed she saw. Ophi took the breakfast tray and started back up the stairs. These stairs were dark and spooky because there was no window opening on them. About halfway up the stairs, she met Wool on his way down. Ophi gave a terrible yell and dropped the tray. Wool, who was still nervous after the trouble with the gophers, let out a hoot and tried to fly. He and Ophi arrived at the bottom of the stairs together, all in one flapping lump. After my father got her quieted down, Ophi went straight to her room and packed her bags. She marched out of the house without even saying goodbye to Wool and me, and none of us ever saw her again. Dad was unhappy. After breakfast, he called me into his study for a talk. "Billy," he said, "if that owl ever comes into this house again, he goes into the roasting pan. And as for you, you'll get a licking you'll remember for a week." But my father never stayed mad long. The very same afternoon, he got out his carpenter's tools, and he and I worked until supper time making a special cage for Wool. It was a big cage, about 10 feet square, and covered all over with chicken wire. It was built around the stump of a dead tree which stood in the backyard, and on the side of the tree Dad nailed a wooden box as a place where Wool could go to keep dry if it rained. Wool liked the new cage all right, but the only trouble was that he got lonely when he was left in it. As long as Murray or Bruce or I was with him, he was perfectly happy. But when there was nobody around, he would sit on the tree stump all hunched up, looking miserable. I tried putting some pigeons in to keep him company, but they were scared of him and he was nervous of them, so that didn't work. About 2 weeks later, the problem solved itself. It was a Tuesday, and I was biking home from school along the alley behind our block. As I came along, I saw a couple kids standing beside a big oil drum and dropping stones into it. One of the kids was Georgie Barnes, but the other was a big kid I didn't know. Georgie saw me coming and gave a yell. "Hi, Billy. Come over here and have some fun." What those two kids were doing wasn't fun at all. In the bottom of the barrel was a baby owl, and for a minute I thought it was Wool until I saw it was smaller and a lot darker in color. It was the dirtiest bird I ever saw. Its feathers were all ruffled and broken, and it was smeared with oil. The kids were dropping stones on it, and every time a stone hit it, it would scrunch down and make a weepy noise, like a tin whistle with a tremble on it. I wanted to tell him to stop dropping stones, but I knew that would mean a fight, and I knew I couldn't lick the two of them. "Where'd you get it?" I asked the big kid. "What's it to you, Shorty?" "Well," I said, "I've kind of a zoo at my place, and I could sure use an owl." "What you gonna give me for him?" "Give you my scout knife." "Let's have a look." I showed it to him, and he opened all the blades, and then he said, "It ain't much good, but this here owl ain't much good either. Pretty near dead. Okay, kid, it's yours." Funny how some kids are. One minute, Georgie Barnes was trying to kill the little owl with stones, but the moment I bought it, he began to act as if he wanted to be its nurse. He climbed into the barrel and handed it out to me, and then he followed me home and helped me clean some of the oil off it with a rag. He told me the big kid had found an owl's nest in a bluff near Sutherland, and had shot the old owl and all but one of the young ones with his .22 rifle. He only brought the last one home as sort of a joke he was going to play on his dog. It was a pretty sick little owl. I guess it hadn't eaten anything for a long time, and the stones and the oil hadn't done it any good either. It was too sick to sit on a branch of the tree in Wool's cage. So I put it on the floor of the cage while I went to the house to get some hamburger for it. When I got back, the new owl was lying on its side and Wool was standing over it. I thought he must have taken a whack at it, but Georgie said no, that wasn't what had happened. Georgie said the new owl had just fallen over by itself, and when Georgie tried to pick it up again, Wool jumped down out of the tree and wouldn't let Georgie near it. When I went to the cage and held some meat out toward the new owl, Wool hunched down, spread his wings, and hissed at me, as if it were saying, "You leave that bird alone, or you'll have me to deal with." "Easy there," I told him. "Take it easy, Wool. This little fellow's hungry, and I'm just going to feed him." I don't know if Wool understood me, but he stopped hissing anyway. I held out some bits of hamburger against the new owl's beak, and after a while, he took a piece. Finally, he ate the whole lot. Then he staggered to his feet and stood there swaying back and forth. Before I could touch him, Wool sidled over until the new owl was leaning right against him. Then the new bird closed his eyes and seemed to go to sleep. That's the way we left them. By the next morning, the new owl was up on the branch with Wool, and from that time on, Wool was never lonely. When Dad got home from the office that evening, I told him all about it. I told him the new one was called Weeps because of the weepy whistle noise he made all the time. "2 owls!" my father cried and banged his hand against his forehead. "Now we'll never get another made. All right, Billy, but no more owls. You understand?" He needn't have worried. 2 owls was all I wanted anyway. Chapter 5. Though there were only a few more weeks left of school before the summer holidays began, each day seemed 100 years long. I could hear the river boiling over the sandbars as I sat at my desk, and I could smell the sticky, sweet smell of the young poplar leaves. Our school stood right beside the river, and every now and then a flock of ducks would go over the playground, quack, quack, quacking as if they were laughing at us for being stuck inside while they were flying free across the wide prairie. What made it even worse for me was just sitting there wondering what my owls were doing. After school, I would jump on my bike and pedal like 40 over the bridge and down our street. When I got close to home, I would give a couple of owl hoots to let Wool and Weeps know I was coming. By the time I skidded into the yard and parked my bike, they would be tramping impatiently up and down the cage. As soon as the door was open, they would come waddling out as fast as they could, ready for play. Wool liked to scramble up on the back of an old lawn chair. Then he would take a wild leap and try to land on my shoulder. If he missed, he would nosedive into the lawn, but it never bothered him much. He would hop back to the chair, climb up, and try again until he finally made my shoulder. Weeps was different. He never believed he could do anything by himself, and so he would just sit on the lawn and whimper until I picked him up and put him on my other shoulder. I think Weeps' spirit must have been broken in the oil drum, because as long as I knew him, he was always afraid of doing things. With both owls riding on my shoulders, I used to go down the street where our gang played games in an empty lot. Can the Can was a favorite game that spring, sort of a combination of baseball and football. We used an inflated rubber beach ball that belonged to Murray, and when all the kids got chasing it, Wool would get so excited he would join in too. One time he got in the way of the ball just when someone kicked it, and it knocked the wind clean out of him. The next time the ball came near him, he made a jump and got a hold of it with both sets of claws. There was a hissing noise and the ball went limp. Wool was pleased as punch, but we weren't, because it was the only ball we had. All the kids, except Bruce and Murray, were a bit scared of the owls, so when I had them on my shoulders, I could go anywhere in Saskatoon and be safe as houses. Even the tough kids down by the flour mill kept their distance when I had the owls with me. Those owls were better bodyguards than tigers. Wool and Weeps grew fast. Weeps would eat anything he could get and still be hungry, but Wool was fussy about his food. At first, Wool would only eat cooked butcher's meat, hard-boiled eggs, and fig cookies. Later on, he would eat anything that came from our table, even vegetables, all except parsnips, which he hated. Occasionally, both owls would eat a dead gopher that some kid had shot or snared as a present for them, but they didn't really like their supper raw. By the middle of June, when they were 3 months old, my new pets had reached full size. Wool was a little bigger than Weeps and stood about 2 feet high, but his wingspan was nearly 5 feet across. The claws of both were about an inch long and as sharp as needles, and their big hooked beaks looked strong enough to open a tin can. Weeps was a normal owl color, sort of a mottled brown, but Wool stayed almost pure white, with the few black markings on his feathers. At night, he looked like a ghost. Although they were grown up now, neither of the owls seemed to know what his wings were for. Because they saw us walking around, they seemed to think they had to walk around too. Maybe if I had been able to fly, they would have learned to fly a lot sooner. But the way things were, both owls tried to do what we kids did. They saw us climbing trees, so they took to climbing trees. It was pretty silly to watch Will climbing. He used to really climb. First he'd jump up to a low branch, then he'd use his beak and claws to half lift himself and half shimmy to the next branch. My pigeons used to circle around sometimes and watch him. They must have thought he was crazy. People sometimes thought so too. One day Will was climbing a poplar in our front yard when a man and a woman stopped on the sidewalk and watched him, with their mouths open. Finally the man said to me, "What on earth's the matter with that bird? Why doesn't he fly to the top of the tree?" "He can't fly, sir," I replied. "He never learned how." The man looked at me as if I were crazy too, and walked off without another word. The day Will actually learned to fly was one I'll remember for a long time. He'd climbed a cottonwood in the backyard, and had got way out on a thin little branch and couldn't get back. You never saw an owl look so unhappy. He kept teetering up and down at the end of the branch, and hoo-hooing at me to come and get him out of this fix. Dad and Mother came out to see what was going on, and they started to laugh. Because who ever heard of a bird that couldn't get itself out of a tree? But when people laughed at Wool, it hurt his feelings and upset him. Well, with the laughter and the fact that it was supper time, and he was hungry, Wool got careless. Finally, he teetered a little too far forward and lost his balance. "Ooh, ooh," he shrieked as he bounced through the branches towards the ground. Then, all of a sudden, he spread his wings, and the next thing any of us knew, he was flying. Well, sort of flying. Not having done it before, he didn't really know what he was doing, even then. You could tell he was just as surprised as we were. He came swooshing out of the tree like a rocket, and he seemed to be heading straight for me, but I ducked, and he pulled up and went shooting back into the air again. He was still hoo-hooing like mad when he stalled and slid back, downward, tail first, and hit the ground with an awful thump. By that time, I was laughing so hard I had to lie on the grass and hold my stomach. When I looked up at last, it was to see Wool stomping into his cage. He was furious with all of us, and I couldn't persuade him to come out again until next day. At supper that night, my father said, "You know, I don't believe that owl realizes that he's an owl. I believe he thinks he's a human being. You'll have to educate him, Billy." It wasn't quite as bad as that. Wool eventually did learn to fly pretty well, but he never seemed to like flying, or to trust it. He still preferred to walk wherever he was going. Weeps never learned to fly at all. I tried to teach him how by throwing him off the garage roof, but he wouldn't try. He would just shut his eyes, give a hopeless kind of moan, and fall like a rock without even opening his wings. Weeps didn't believe he could fly, and that was that. Just before school ended, Wool learned a new trick, which bothered me a lot. He discovered that if he took a good swipe at it with his claws, he could tear a hole in the chicken wire of the cage. Once he learned how to do this, it was impossible to keep him penned up when he didn't want to be. This worried me because there were a lot of tough alley cats, and tough dogs too, in Saskatoon. I was afraid if one of them ever got a hold of Weeps or Wool, when I wasn't around, then that would be the end. After a look at the owl's claws and beaks, Mother said she thought it would be the end of any cat or dog that tackled Wool or Weeps, but I still worried. One night, Wool had a little argument with Mud about a bone, and Wool got mad and wouldn't come down out of his tree to go to his cage at dusk. I called him, but he just ignored me, and finally I had to go off to bed and leave him out. I slept pretty lightly that night, with one ear cocked for trouble, because I knew the cats would be about. Sure enough, just as dawn, I heard a squawk and a scuffling noise outside. I hopped out of bed, grabbed my air gun, and whipped out of the house as fast as I could. Well, it wasn't in the tree. In fact, there was no sign of him anywhere in the front yard. I raced around the corner to the back, expecting to find him dead and eaten, but instead I found him asleep on the back porch steps. He had his feathers ruffled out, the way birds do when they're asleep, and it wasn't until I got right up to him that I saw the cat. Wool was sitting on it, and only its head and tail stuck out beneath its feathers. But enough was showing that I could see that this cat wasn't going to bother anybody anymore. I pulled Wool off, and he grumbled a little bit. I think he found that cats make good foot warmers. It was a big ginger tomcat that lived 2 doors down, and belonged to a big man who didn't like kids. This cat had been the terror of birds, other cats, and even of the dogs in the neighborhood for years. I got a shovel and buried it at the bottom of the garden. I suppose the cat had thought Wool was some new kind of chicken. Well, he found out differently. Dogs were no problem to my owls either. Though Mutt was no owl lover himself, he wouldn't let any strange dog chase them, not without a fight. Several times he saved Weeps from a mauling. But he didn't need to look after Wool. There was a German shepherd who lived near us, and one day this dog met Wool out walking, and decided to see how horned owl tasted. I heard the ruckus and came running, but by the time I got to the street, Wool was sitting on the dog's back, digging his claws in for all he was worth, and ripping chunks out of the dog's ears with his beak. The shepherd headed down Spadina Avenue, yip yip yipping, till you could have heard it in Timbuktu. Wool rode him for 3 blocks, and might have ridden him right out of town if the dog hadn't dodged through a hole of the board fence and knocked Wool off. I had chased after them on my bike, but by the time I got to the fence, Wool had picked himself up, given himself a shake or two to settle his feathers, and was his usual friendly self. He gave me a cheerful hoo 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 hoo, and jumped up on the handlebars for a ride home. Word seemed to get around after that, and the neighborhood dogs took to crossing over to the other side of the road when they saw Wool coming. Chapter 6. On the day school closed for the summer, the T. Eden department store announced it was going to sponsor a pet parade 2 weeks later, and there were going to be prizes for the most interesting pets and the best displays. Bruce was the first of our gang to hear about it, and he came right over to my house to tell Murray and me. "Hey," said Bruce, after he told us all he knew, "with the animals we got, we could win 12 prizes. What about it?" Murray and I didn't need much convincing. We spent the next couple of days planning what we'd do. First, we decided to hitch Mutt and Rex to my old express wagon. We would fix it up with colored cardboard and stuff so it looked like a circus wagon. We planned to put an old fur muff of my mother's around Mutt's neck to make him look like a lion, and we were going to paint black stripes on Rex so he would look like a zebra. Then we decided to build a circus cage on the wagon and fill it with different kinds of gophers. Finally, we decided to have the owls riding on top of the cage, all dressed up in dolls' clothes. We had 2 weeks to get things ready, and we really worked. First, we built the circus cage, and when we were finished, it looked just like the real ones that used to come to Saskatoon with the Bailey Brothers Circus every summer. Ours wasn't as strong, though, because the sides were only cardboard, painted red and blue and yellow, and instead of iron bars, we used chicken wire to keep the gophers from getting out. When it was finished, we made a hike out to the bluffs near the exhibition grounds, because that was a good place to find wood gophers. We caught 6 of them, and on the way home we snared about 12 striped gophers that were living in a cut bank by the roadside. Together with the 30 ordinary gophers we already had, this added up to an awful lot of gophers, and there wasn't going to be room for all of them in one circus cage. Murray fixed that. "Why don't we make another cage out of my wagon?" he suggested. "Then we'd have twice as much a chance to win first prize." It was a dandy idea, so we went ahead and built the second cage. Then we decided to put some of our white rats with the extra gophers in the second one to make it different. The day before the parade, which was on a Saturday, we had everything ready. I borrowed some doll's clothes from Faith Honnigan, who lived on the next block. Murray had got some washable sign paint from his dad so he could paint the black stripes on Rex. We'd found a real dog harness for Mutt, and we made a second set for Rex out of twine. The cage wagons were all finished and stored away in our garage so they wouldn't get wet if it rained. On Sunday morning, I didn't even wait to eat my breakfast before I rushed out to the garage. Murray was already there, but Bruce didn't come along for about an hour, and we were getting real worried that he might not make it at all. By the time he showed up, we had the gophers and the rats all loaded up, and I was trying to get the doll's clothes on the owls. Bruce came into the yard with a shoebox under his arm, with a big grin on his face. "Hi!" he shouted. "I guess we'll win first prize, sure. But you can't guess what I have in this box." Murray and I couldn't guess. I shook the box a couple times, and whatever was inside was pretty heavy. I was just going to untie the string and open it when Bruce grabbed it away from me. "No, sir," he said. "Don't you do that. We might never catch this critter again." "Aw, come on," I begged him. "What you got in there, anyway? Come on, Bruce, you have to tell us." Don't have to, don't aim to, Bruce said. Just you wait and see. Murray and I pretended we didn't care what he had in the shoebox anyway. I went back to putting doll's clothes on the owls, and it wasn't easy. Weeps just stood there and whimpered while I pulled a pink dress over his head and pinned a floppy hat on him. But Wool took one look at the sailor suit I had for him, and then he rumpled himself up into a ball and began to clack his beak and hiss. It took two of us to hold him down while we got him dressed, and by the time we were finished, he was in a terrible temper. We couldn't trust him to stay quietly on the wagon top after all that fuss, so we decided to tie him to it with some twine around his legs, and that made it madder still. While Bruce and I were working on the owls, Murray was trying to paint the stripes on Rex. Rex didn't like it, and there was about as much black paint on Murray as the dog. Just before we were ready to start for downtown, Bruce took the paintbrush and printed some words on the shoebox. Then he tied the box to the top of the second wagon. What he printed was, "Surprise pet, do not feed." We harnessed up the dogs, with Mutt leading because he knew how to pull in a harness, and Rex didn't. Rex didn't seem to want to learn either. He kept pulling off to one side, and every time he did it, he almost upset the wagons. We had an awful lot of time getting our outfit all the way downtown, and we were nearly late for the parade, which started at 10 o'clock. One thing, though, by the time we did get there, old Rex was just about worn out, and he'd stopped acting like a bucking bronco. The parade formed in front of the Carnegie Public Library, and then it was supposed to go about 6 blocks to the T. Eaton store where the judge's stand was. It seemed like 1,000,000 kids were there, with every kind of pet you ever saw. One little boy, about 5 years old, was leading a Clydesdale horse as big as an elephant, and the horse had "baby" on the blanket it was wearing. If that thing was a baby, I hoped to eat it. There were a lot of goats, and it was a hot day, and you could smell goats all over Saskatoon. Some of the girls were wheeling cats along in baby carriages, and the cats were wearing silly hats and were pinned down under the lacy covers. Some of them were yowling fit to scare the dead. There were more dogs than you could shake a stick at, every kind of dog you ever heard about, and a lot of kinds that no one ever heard about. Right in the middle of the parade was a boy leading a pet skunk on a string. He had the middle of the parade all to himself, too. Nobody was crowding him. There were pet rabbits, ducks, chickens, geese, a couple of pigs, and a bunch of pedigree calves. There was even one little boy carrying a quart jar full of water with a bunch of tadpoles swimming around in it. You'd expect lots of trouble with all the animals and the fact that it was a hot day and everybody was excited and there was so much noise, but there really wasn't much trouble. There were dog fights, of course, and one dog, who wasn't even in the parade at all, made it go for a cat in a baby carriage, and that stampeded one of the goats, but some salesmen from the store were in the parades too, and they got things quieted down, though one of them got bitten in the leg a little bit. It took about an hour for our outfit to get to the opposite of the judge's stand. There were 5 judges, some women, some men. The mayor of Saskatoon was one of them. There were 2 Mounties beside the stand, dressed in their red coats. A lot of parents were jammed up against the stand, too, so they could cheer if their kids won a prize. I'd had a good look at the parade by then, and there wasn't an outfit that had a patch on ours. We were sure to win a good prize, and I figured it would be first prize. We had a little trouble, though, when we got to the stand because Rex was so tired he just lay down and wouldn't get up again. But that only made the judges laugh, and they came down from the stand to take a good look at our entry. I overheard one of the women judges tell another woman that ours was the best rig she'd seen, and "Isn't it cute the way it's decked out just like a real circus?" The first prize seemed to be right in our pockets, when the president of the T. Eaton store, who was also one of the judges, saw the shoebox on top of the second wagon. "Hello," he said. "Now here's a good idea. Look at this, Sam. These boys have a special pet in reserve. That's what I call smart merchandising." Well, of course, everyone crowded around to see what the special pet was, and Bruce, with a silly smile on his dopey face, untied the box and lifted the lid. What was in the box was a rattlesnake. I guess you can imagine what happened next. All the people shoving and pushing to get away from us got the animals so upset that they began to stampede too. The skunk got crowded into a storefront, and that scared him, and he did what skunks always do when they get scared. There were calves and goats going every which way, and the dogs all went crazy and started chasing anything that ran. and that was everything there was. Our two cages got upset and squashed, and all the gophers and white rats went skittering off under people's feet. Walt climbed up on top of my head and kept beating his wings so I couldn't see too much of what was happening, but I could still hear it. Women were screaming, and one of the Mounties had hauled out his big revolver and was waving it in the air, while the other one never stopped blowing his silver whistle. All you could hear was yells and howls and barks and screams and yowls. I tell you, there's never been anything like it in Saskatoon for 100 years. We didn't stick around any longer than we could help. We saved the wagons, our two dogs, the owls, and that darn snake. Bruce grabbed the shoebox the moment the ruckus started and stuck to it like a burr until we got back to my place. "Gee," he said, as we were getting a drink from our garden hose. "If I'd lost that old snake, I'd have got my britches staying from here to Mexico. It belongs to our hired man. It's been his pet for 15 years, ever since he was a cowboy down in the Cypress Hills. It's so old it hasn't any teeth, nor any poison either, but he sure is fond of it all the same. It sleeps right with him in his bunk." I still think we should have won first prize. Chapter 7. When the owls first came to live with us, Mutt didn't think much of them. He was jealous of all my pets, and he was particularly jealous of the owls because they took up so much of my time. He never did get on very well with Wool, but after a few weeks he got on so that he could tolerate Weeps. I think this was because Weeps was so helpless, and because Mutt had to defend him from other dogs, from the neighborhood cats, and of course Weeps was very fond of Mutt, knowing he could depend on the old boy to protect him. Whenever Weeps was let out of his cage, he would start searching around for Mutt. Once he spotted him, Weeps would give a little whoop of relief and go scuttle over to his protector's side. If Mutt was lying down, Weeps would snuggle in between his paws. Sometimes he would get so close that his horn feathers would tickle Mutt's nose, and then Mutt would sneeze and almost blow Weeps over backward. If Weeps got to be too much of a nuisance, Mutt would try to hide from him under the garage. But that wasn't much use. Weeps would squeeze under the garage too. He hated to let Mutt get out of his sight for even a minute. Mutt's relations with Wool were another story. Wool wasn't afraid of anything that walked, flew, or crawled, and that included Mutt. As far as Wool was concerned, old Mutt was something to be teased and pestered, and Wool used to tease the life half out of him. Mutt was an absent-minded sort of dog. Instead of burying a bone he didn't happen to be using at the moment, he would often forget about it and leave it lying on the grass. That was a mistake, because sooner or later, Wool would see it, swoop down, and carry it off. It wasn't that Wool liked bones himself. Not having any teeth, he couldn't chew them. He just liked to take them away from Mutt. Once he had the bone, he would put it somewhere where Mutt could see it or smell it, but couldn't reach it. Sometimes he would put the bone in the crotch of a tree just high enough so Mutt couldn't get up and get it. Or sometimes he would hide it in the gutters of the porch roof so that the nice rich bone smell would drift down and torment Mutt until he was nearly crazy. Another of Wool's tricks was stealing Mutt's dinner. Mutt used to be fed on the back porch about 5 o'clock each afternoon. When Wool was feeling particularly bored or ornery, he would play that dinner-stealing game. Having waited until Mutt started eating, Wool would scoot around to the front of the house and set up such a ruckus that it sounded like 2 dogfights and a cat fight all happening at once. Mutt always fell for it. As soon as he heard the row, he would come tearing around the corner, woof, woof, woofing, all ready for trouble. But while he was peering around in his short-sighted way to see where the trouble was, Wool would have flown over the top of the house and be gobbling down Mutt's dinner on the back porch. When Mutt got back and found the plate empty, he would look very puzzled. Being absent-minded, he wouldn't always remember whether he had finished his dinner or not. All he knew was that he still felt hungry. But Wool's favorite game with Mutt was the tail squeeze. Mutt was already a fairly old dog when the owls came to live with us, and during the heat of the summer afternoons he liked to have a snooze under the poplar trees in the front yard. He'd hollowed out a bed for himself in the moist earth beneath the trees where he could lie in comfort until the sun started to go down and the air began to get a little cooler. Wool, on the other hand, never seemed to sleep at all, although according to the bird books, horned owls are supposed to sleep all day and hunt all night. Perhaps because Wool had never read those books, he was just as active in the daytime as at night, and maybe more so. On summer days, when I was always away somewhere and there were no kids around to play with, Wool would get bored, and that was usually when he would play the tail squeeze game. After first making sure Mutt was really fast asleep, Wool would begin to stalk the old dog the way a cat would stalk a bird. He always did it on foot. I think because he felt it wouldn't be playing fair to use his wings. Starting from the front porch, Wool would sneak across the lawn, moving so slowly and carefully he hardly seemed to move at all. If Mutt happened to raise his head, he would see Wool standing stock still on the grass and staring innocently up at the sky, as if he were wondering whether it was going to rain. After a long suspicious look at Wool, Mutt's eyelids would begin to droop, his head would sag, and soon he would be fast asleep again. He snored, too, and as soon as the snores started, Wool would continue his slow and careful approach. Sometimes it took Wool an hour or more to cross the lawn, but he did it so quietly and cautiously that Mutt never really had a chance. When he had sneaked up close enough, Wool would raise one big foot and very, very gently lower it over the end of Mutt's long and bushy tail. Then Wool would let out a piercing scream, and at the same moment he would give the tail a good hard squeeze. Poor Mutt would leap straight into the air, yelping with surprise and pain. By the time he got his bearings and was ready to take a bite out of Wool, the owl would have flown to the limb of a nearby tree, from which he would peer down at Mutt as much to say, "Good heavens, what a terrible nightmare you must have been having." Mutt would roar and froth around the tree, daring Wool to come down and fight like a dog. Then Wool would make things even worse by closing his eyes and pretending to go sound asleep. Although Wool loved practical jokes, the funny thing was that he never really harmed other animals if he could help it. Of course, if something tried to hurt him, that was different. Then Wool could be dangerous. But he certainly wasn't the fierce and bloodthirsty kind of bird that owls are supposed to be. He wouldn't even go hunting on his own. If a gopher or a white rat happened to get loose on the lawn, he wouldn't touch it. However, there was one kind of animal he would attack, and that was a skunk. It seems that all horned owls just naturally hate skunks, though no one knows the reason why. What's more, horned owls are the only things I know of that will eat a skunk, and even seem to like the taste. Our house in Saskatoon stood close to the river, and along the bank of the river was a regular jungle of bushes and poplar trees that made an ideal place for skunks to live. Because they didn't have any enemies in town, the riverbank skunks became so cocky they would stroll along the sidewalk in front of our place as boldly as if they owned it. That was before Wool came to live with us. Cocky as ever, one of the riverbank skunks decided to take a walk down Crescent Avenue one summer evening just after Wool had learned to fly. The skunk came strutting along the sidewalk, quite sure nothing in the world would dare to bother him. He ambled along, taking his own time, until he got under the overhanging branches of our poplar trees. Mother and Dad and I were having dinner. The dining room windows were open because it had been such a hot day. All of a sudden, there was a great swoosh of wings, and there, on the windowsill, sat Wool. Before any of us had time to move, he gave a leap and landed on the floor beside my chair. And he hadn't come empty-handed. Clutched in his talons was an enormous skunk. The skunk was dead, but that didn't help matters much because before he died, he'd managed to soak himself and Wool with his own special brand of perfume. "Hoo hoo hoo," Wool said proudly, which probably meant, "Mind if I join you? I've brought my supper with me." Nobody stopped to answer. We three people were already stampeding through the door of the dining room, coughing and choking. Wool had to eat his dinner by himself. It was 2 weeks before we could use the dining room again, and when Mother sent the rug and drapes to the cleaners, the man who owned the shop phoned her right back and wanted to know if she was trying to ruin him. Wool didn't smell so sweet either, but he couldn't understand why he was so unpopular all of a sudden. His feelings must have been hurt by the way everybody kept trying to avoid him. After 2 or 3 days, when even I wouldn't go near him, or let him come near me, he became very unhappy. Then an idea must have come into his funny head. He must have decided that we were mad at him because he hadn't shared his skunk with us. So one day he went down to the riverbank and caught a second skunk and brought it home for us. By this time he was so soaked in skunk oil that you could smell him a block away. Some of our neighbors complained about it, and so finally my father had to give Wool a bath in about a gallon of tomato juice. Tomato juice is the only thing that will wash away the smell of a skunk. Poor Wool. By the time Dad was through with him, he looked like a rag mop that had been dipped in ketchup. But he got the idea, and he never again brought his skunks home to us. Chapter 8. The banks of the Saskatchewan River were very steep where the river ran through the prairie to the south of Saskatoon, and about 2 miles downstream from the city was a perfect place for digging caves. Bruce and Murray and I had our summer headquarters down there, in an old cave some hobos had dug a long time ago. They'd fixed it up with logs and pieces of wood so it wouldn't collapse. You have to be careful of caves, because if they don't have good strong logs to hold up the roof, the whole thing can fall down and kill you. This was a good cave we had, though. My dad had even come down there and looked it over to make sure it was safe for us. We had a door made of a piece of tin roofing, and there was a smokestack going up through the ceiling. Inside was a sort of bench where you could lie down, and we had 2 old butter crates for chairs. We put dry hay down on the floor for a carpet, and under the hay there was a secret hole where we could hide anything that was specially valuable. The river ran only a hop, skip, and a jump from the door to the cave. There was a big sandbar close by, which made a backwater where the current was slow enough for swimming. Standing right beside the swimming hole was the biggest cottonwood tree in the whole of Saskatchewan. We used to go to our cave a couple times a week during the summer holidays, and we usually took the owls along. Wool had learned how to ride on the handlebars of my bicycle, but Weeps couldn't keep his balance there, so we built a kind of box for him and tied it to the carrier behind the seat. Mutt and Rex used to come too, chasing cows whenever they got a chance, or racing away across the prairie after jackrabbits. We would bike out to the end of 3rd Avenue and then back along an old Indian trail that ran along the top of the riverbank. When we got close to the cave, we would hide our bikes in the willows and then climb down the bank and follow a secret path. There were some pretty tough kids in Saskatoon, and we didn't want them to find our cave if we could help it. Wool loved those trips. All the way out, he would bounce up and down on the handlebars, hooting to himself with excitement, or hooting out insults at any passing dog. When we came to the place where we hid the bikes, he would fly up to the poplars and follow us through the tops of the trees. He usually stayed pretty close, though, because if he didn't, some crows would sure spot him, and then they would call up to all the other crows for miles and try to mob him. When that happened, he would just come zooming down to the cave and bang on the door with his beak until we let him in. He wasn't afraid of the crows. It was just that he couldn't fight back when they tormented him. As for Weeps, he usually stayed right in the cave where he felt safe. One summer afternoon, when we were at the cave, we decided to go for a swim. The 3 of us shucked off our clothes and raced for the sandbar, hollering at each other. "Last one in's a Dutchman." In half a minute, we were in the water, splashing around and rolling in the slippery black mud along the edge of the sandbar. It was great stuff to fight with, nice and soft and slithery. It packed into mushy mud balls that made a wonderful splash when they hit something. Whenever we went swimming, Wool would come along and find a perch in the hanging tree where he could watch the fun. He would get out on the big limb that hung over the water, and the more fuss and noise we made, the more excited he became. He would walk back and forth along the limb, hoo-hooing and ruffling his feathers, and you could tell he just felt he was missing out on the fun. This particular day, he couldn't stand it any longer, so he came down out of the tree and waddled right to the river's edge. We were skylarking on the sandbar when I saw him, so I gave a yell. "Hey, Wool! Come on there, Wool, old owl! Come on out here!" Of course, I thought he would fly across the strip of open water and light on the dry sand where we were playing. But I forgot Wool had never had any experience with the water before, except in his drinking bowl at home. He got his experience in a hurry. Instead of spreading his wings, he lifted up 1 foot very deliberately and started to walk across the water towards us. It didn't take him long to find out he couldn't do it. There was an almighty splash, and spray flew every which way. By the time we raced across and fished him out, he was half drowned, and about the sickest-looking bird you ever saw. His feathers were plastered down until he looked as skinny as a plucked chicken. The slimy black mud hadn't improved his looks much either. I carried him ashore, but he didn't thank me for it. His feelings were hurt worse than he was, and after he had shaken most of the water out of his feathers, He went good-lumping off through the woods towards home on foot. He was too wet to fly, without a backward glance. Toward the middle of July, Bruce and I got permission from our parents to spend a night in the cave. Murray couldn't come because his mother wouldn't let him. We took Wool and Weeps with us, and of course we both had dogs. In the afternoon, we went for a hike over the prairie looking for birds. Mutt, who was running ahead of us, flushed a prairie chicken off her nest. There were 10 eggs in the nest, and they were just hatching out. We sat down beside the nest and watched. In an hour's time, 7 little chickens had hatched before our eyes. It was pretty exciting to see, and Wool seemed just as curious about it as we were. Then all of a sudden, 3 of the newly hatched little birds slipped out of the nest and scuttled straight for Wool. Before he could move, they were underneath him, crowding against his big feet, and peeping happily. I guess he thought he was their mother, because they hadn't seen their real mother yet. Wool was so surprised he didn't know what to do. He kept lifting up one foot and then the other to shake off the little ones. When the other 4 babies joined the first 3, Wool began to get nervous. But finally he seemed to resign himself to being a mother, and he fluffed out his feathers and lowered himself very gently to the ground. Bruce and I nearly died laughing. The sight of the baby prairie chickens popping their heads out through Wool's feathers, and that great big beak of his snapping anxiously in the air right over their heads, was the silliest thing I've ever seen. I guess Wool knew it was silly too, but he couldn't figure out how to get out of the mess he was in. He kept looking at me as if he were saying, "For heaven's sake, do something!" I don't know how long he would have stayed there, but we began to worry that the real mother might not find her chicks, so I finally lifted him up and put him on my shoulder, and we went back to the cave for supper. We'd had a good laugh at Wool, but he had the laugh on us before the day was done. After we had eaten, we decided to go down to the riverbank and wait for the sun to set. A pair of coyotes lived on the opposite bank of the river, and every evening just at sunset one of them would climb a little hill and sit there howling. It was a scary sound, but we liked it because it made us feel that this was the olden times, and the prairie belonged to us, and to the buffaloes and the Indians, and to the prairie wolves. Wool was sitting in the hanging tree, and Rex and Mutt had gone off somewhere on a hunting trip of their own. It was growing dusk when we heard a lot of crashing in the trees behind us. We turned around just as 2 big kids came into sight. They were 2 of the toughest kids in Saskatoon. If they hadn't come on us so suddenly, we would have been running before they ever saw us. But now it was too late to run. They would have caught us before we could go 10 feet. The only thing we could do was sit where we were and hope they would leave us alone. What a hope that was. They came right over, and one of them reached down and grabbed Bruce and started to twist his arm behind his back. "Listen, you little rats," he said. "We heard you got a cave somewhere down here. You're too young to own a cave, so we're taking over. Show us where it is, or I'll twist your arm right off." The other big kid made a grab for me, but I slipped past him, and was just starting to run when he stuck out his foot and tripped me. Then he sat on me. "Say, Joe," he said to his pal, "I got an idea. Either these kids tell us where the cave is, or we tie 'em to the old hanging tree and leave 'em there all night with the Injun's ghost." Just then the coyote across the river gave a great howl. All 4 of us jumped a little with the talk of ghosts, but Joe said, "That ain't nothing, just a coyote howling. You gonna tell us, kid, or do we tie you to the tree?" Bruce and I knew they were only trying to scare us, but we were scared all right. I was just opening my mouth to tell them where the cave was when Wool took a hand in things. He'd been sitting on the big limb of the hanging tree, and since it was almost dark by then, he looked like a big white blob up there. I don't think he'd been paying much attention to what was happening on the ground below him, but when that coyote howled, he must have thought it was some kind of challenge. He opened his beak and gave the owl hunting scream. Did you ever hear a horned owl scream? Usually they do it at night to scare any mice or rabbits that happen to be hiding near into jumping or running. Then the owl swoops down and grabs them. If you've ever heard an owl scream, you'll know it's just about the most scary sound in all the world. When Wool cut loose, it made even my skin creep, and I knew what it was, but the 2 big kids didn't know. Their heads jerked up and they saw the ghostly white shape that was Wool up there in the hanging tree, and then they were off and running. They went right through the poplar woods like a couple of charging buffaloes, and we could hear still them breaking bush when they were half a mile away. My guess is they ran all the way to Saskatoon. When they were out of hearing, Bruce stood up and began rubbing his arm. Then he looked at Wool. "Boy," he said, "you sure scared those two old roughnecks silly. But did you have to scare me right out of my skin too?" "Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo," Wool chuckled as he floated down out of the tree and lit upon my shoulder. Chapter 9. Wool and Weeps were with us long enough to be well known in Saskatoon, particularly Wool. As my father said, Wool never quite realized he was an owl. Most of the time, he seemed to think he was people. At any rate, he liked being with people, and he wanted to be with us so much that we finally had to stop trying to keep him out of the house. If we locked him out, he would come and bang his big beak against the window panes so hard we were afraid the glass would break. Screens were no good either, because he would tear them open with one big sweep of his claws. So eventually, he became a house owl. He was always very well mannered in the house, and he caused no trouble, except on one particular occasion. One midsummer day, we had a visit from a new minister of our church. He had just arrived in Saskatoon, so he didn't know much about our owls. Mother took him into the living room, and he sat down on our sofa with a cup of tea balancing on his knee, and he began to talk to Mother about me skipping Sunday school. Wool had been off on an expedition down on the riverbank. When he got home, he ambled across the lawn, jumped up onto the ledge of the living room windows, and peered in. Spotting the stranger, he gave another leap and landed heavily on the minister's shoulder. Mother had seen him coming and had tried to warn the minister, but she was too late. By the time she had her mouth open, Wool was already hunched down on the man's shoulder, peering around into his face, making friendly owl noises. "Hoo-hoo?" he asked politely. Instead of answering, the minister let out a startled yelp and sprang to his feet. The tea spilled all over the rug, and the teacup shot into the fireplace and smashed into a million pieces. It was all so sudden that Wool lost his balance, and when he lost his balance, his talons just naturally tightened up to help him steady himself. When Wool tightened his grip, the minister gave a wild Indian yell and made a dash for the door. Wool had never been treated this way before. He didn't like it. Just as the minister reached the front porch, Wool spread his wings and took off. His wings were big, and they were strong, too. One of them clipped the man a bang on the side of his head, making him yell even louder. But by then, Wool was airborne. He flew up into his favorite poplar tree, and he was in such a huff at the way he had been treated that he wouldn't even come down until after supper. Riding on people's shoulders was a favorite pastime with Wool. Usually he was so careful with his big claws that you couldn't even feel them. Sometimes when he was on your shoulder and feeling specially friendly, he would nibble on your ear. His beak was sharp enough to have taken the ear right off your head with a single bite. But he would just catch the bottom of your ear in his beak and very gently nibble it a little. It didn't hurt at all, though it used to make some people nervous. One of my father's friends was a man who worked for the railroad, and he had very big red ears. Every time he came for a visit to our house, he wore a cap with ear flaps. He even wore it in the summertime because, he said, with ears as big as his and an ear-nibbling owl around, he just couldn't afford to take chances. Wool was usually good-natured, but he could get mad. One morning, Mother sent me to the store for some groceries. My bike had a flat tire, so I had to walk. And Wool walked with me. We were only a little way from the house when we met a postman coming towards us. He had a big bundle of letters in his hand, and he was sorting them, and not watching where he was going. Instead of stepping around Wool, he walked right into him. Worse still, he didn't even look down to see what it was he'd stumble over. He just gave kind of a kick to get whatever it was out of his way. Well, you could do a lot of things to Wool and get away with it, but kicking him was something different. Hissing like a giant tea kettle, he spread his wings wide out and clomped the postman on the shins with them. A whack from one of his wings was like a kick of a mule. The postman dropped his handful of letters and went pelting down the street, yelling blue murder, with Wool right on his heels. After I got a hold of Wool and calmed him down, I apologized to the postman, but for a month after that, he wouldn't come into our yard at all. He used to stand at the gate and whistle until one of us came to get the mail. Our owls were so used to going nearly everywhere with me now that when school started that fall, I had a hard time keeping them at home. I used to bicycle to school, which was about 2 miles away across the river. During the first week after school opened, I was late 4 times because of having to take the owls back home after they'd followed me part way. Finally, Dad suggested I lock them up in the big pen each morning just before I left. Wool and Weeps hadn't used that pen for a long time, and when I put them in, they acted as if it was a jail. Wool was particularly furious, and he began to tear at the chicken wire with his beak and claws. I sneaked off fast. I was almost late anyway, and I knew if I was late one more time, I'd be kept in after school. I was about halfway over the river bridge when a man on the footpath gave me a shout and pointed at something behind my back. At the same time, a car coming toward me jammed on its brakes and nearly skidded into the cement railings. Not knowing what was going on, I put on my brakes too, and I just had time to stop when there was a wild rush of air on the back of my neck and a deep "hoo hoo hoo" in my ear, and Wool landed on my shoulder. He was out of breath, but he was so pleased with himself that I didn't have the heart to take him home. Anyway, there wasn't time, so he rolled on the handlebars the rest of the way to school. I skidded into the yard just as the 2-minute bell was ringing, and all the other kids were going through the doors. I couldn't decide what on earth to do with Wool. Then I remembered that I had some twine in my pocket. I fished it out and used it to tie him by one leg to the handlebars. The first class I had that morning was French. Well, between worrying about Wool and not having done my homework, I was soon in trouble with the teacher, whom we called Fifi behind her back. Fifi made me come up in front of the class so she could tell me how dumb I was. I was standing beside her desk, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me, when there was a whump, whump, whump at the window. I turned my head to look, and there sat Wool. It hadn't taken him long to untie the twine. I heard later that he'd banged on the windows of 2 or 3 other classrooms before he found the right one. Having found the right room at last, he didn't waste any time. Unluckily, Fifi had left one of our windows open. Wool ducked down, saw me, and flew right in. He was probably aiming to land on my shoulder, but he missed, and at the last second tried to land on Fifi's desk. It was a polished hardwood desk. He couldn't get a grip on it. His brakes just wouldn't hold. He skated straight across the desk, scattering papers and books all over the floor. Fifi saw him coming and tried to get up out of her chair, but she wasn't fast enough. Wool skidded off the desk and plumped right in her lap. There were some ructions after that. I was sent to the principal's office, and Fifi went home for the rest of the day. The principal was a good fellow, though. He just read me a lecture and warned me that if I didn't keep my owl away from the school in the future, he would have to get the police to do something about it. We finally figured out a way to keep the owls from following me to school. Each morning, just before I left, we would let Wool and Weeps into the kitchen. Mother would feed them bacon rinds left over from breakfast, while I sneaked out the front door and rode away. It worked fine, but it was a little hard on Mother, because the owls got so fond of the kitchen she usually couldn't get them out of it again. Once I heard her telling a friend that until a woman had tried to bake a cake with 2 horned owls looking over her shoulders, she really hadn't lived at all. Chapter 10. 30 miles south of Saskatoon was a little village called Dundurn. It consisted of a garage, a couple of houses, and 2 red wooden grain elevators. Between Dundurn and the Saskatchewan River was a huge expanse of virgin prairie, and right in the middle of it was a slough so big it was almost a real lake, even though the water wasn't very deep. This lake was about the best place for ducks and geese and other water birds in the whole of Saskatchewan. The reed beds along the shores were full of yellow-headed blackbirds, bitterns, coots, and grebes. Out on the open water you could sometimes see 200 or 300 families of ducks, mallards, pintails, shovelers, and lots of other kinds. Sometimes there were flocks of whistling swans, and in the autumn so many geese stopped to rest that they almost hid the water. Every summer we used to camp for a couple of weeks near Dundurn in a 4-wheeled caravan my father had built, which we used to tow behind our Model A Ford. The caravan was fixed up like a little ship. It had ship's bunks, a ship's galley, which is what sailors call a kitchen, ship's lamps, and a ship's clock. On deck, the roof, there was even a little mast with a flag flying from it. People in Saskatoon used to call it Mowat's prairie schooner. On a stormy night, when the wind made the caravan rock back and forth, you could lie snug in your bunk and find it hard to believe you weren't on a real schooner after all. Of course, whenever we took the caravan on a trip, Mutt and the owls had to come along. Our Ford was a convertible with a rumble seat. A rumble seat, something cars don't have anymore, was a sort of folding seat placed where the trunk is on a modern car. This is where Mutt, my owls, and my friends and I used to ride. Mutt always rode with his head and front feet stuck way out over the side of the car, while Bruce or I held onto his tail so he wouldn't fall out on his nose. The owls used to perch on the back of the rumble seat, and they used to hang on for dear life. Because his eyes used to get sore from the dust of the prairie roads, Mutt had to wear goggles, the same kind that motorcycle riders wear. The sight of a goggled dog, two horned owls, and our prairie schooner used to make people in other cars take a long look at us as they went by. Sometimes they didn't believe their eyes, and then they would turn their cars around and follow us to make sure they hadn't been seeing things. During the second summer that the owls lived with us, we went to Dundurn for a camping trip. There was lots of water in the lake that year, and my father brought along his canoe, tied to the deck of the caravan. He paddled Bruce and me all around the lake looking at birds. We must have found 100 ducks' nests, and even found the huge nest of a sandhill crane. The first few times we went out in the canoe, Will came down to the shore to see us off, but he wouldn't come canoeing with us. I think he still remembered the trouble he'd had with the Saskatchewan River at the cave, and he didn't trust water anymore. All the same, he hated to be left out of things. But when Weeps made up his mind to join us in the canoe one day, Will got up his nerve and decided he'd come too. It wasn't a very big canoe, and by the time 2 boys, 1 man, 2 owls, and a dog had climbed in it, it was pretty crowded and pretty low in the water. We had to sit as still as mummies. For a while, Dad paddled in the open lake, and then we began to explore the reed beds. Soon we came to a muskrat's house with the nest of a mallard duck built on top of it. We had a look into the nest and were wondering how long it would be until the eggs hatched out when a crow came swooping over the marsh. He caught sight of our 2 owls and just about went crazy. He cawed and cawed until in about 5 minutes the sky was black with crows. The more that came, the braver they all got, and soon they were diving down within a couple feet of our heads. Dad tried to scare them away by waving his paddle and shouting, but by this time they were so excited they paid no attention to us. I guess no crows had ever caught a pair of owls at such a disadvantage before, and they were going to make the most of it. Weeps scuttled under my seat and hid between my legs, but Wool, who was perched on the bow of the canoe, wasn't going to run away. He kept getting madder and madder until he was hissing and clacking his beak in a perfect fury. This made the crows even more excited, and some of them dived so close that the wind ruffled Wool's feathers. Finally, 1 crow came a bit too close. Suddenly, Wool spread his wings and jumped into the air, and at the same time, he gave a sort of half-turn to his side and grabbed at the crow with both sets of his talons. There was an explosion of black feathers, and the crow went squawking off across the marsh, half-naked. We didn't have time to watch him go. When Wool jumped, Bruce tried to catch him for fear he would fall in the water and be drowned, and that did it. Next second, all of us, except Wool, were in the lake. The water was only up to our knees, but the lake bottom was slimy black muck. As we scrambled to get a hold of the canoe, Bruce and I and Dad got coated from head to foot with slime. Mutt, who had more sense than any of us, abandoned the canoe and headed straight for the muskrat house. Weeps, who must have thought this was the end somehow, managed to clutch the hold of Mutt's tail and was towed to the muskrat house. Wool, who had been flying when the canoe was upset, and who now couldn't find any place to land, kept circling over our heads, hooting at us to help him down. The crows were going wild. All the ducks and geese in the marsh were excited too. Now they started to quack and honk until it was such a row you couldn't have heard a cannon being fired. It took us nearly an hour to get back to the shore. Dad pushed Bruce and me into the flooded canoe somehow. Then he waded ahead, towing us. On the way, we stopped at the muskrat house and rescued Mutt and Weeps. Wool finally grew so tired that he had to land somewhere, and he flopped down on my father's head. This accident made us so angry with crows, any crows, that we could have cheerfully wrung the neck of every crow in Saskatchewan. Next morning, Dad got out his shotgun and swore he was going to even up the score. He decided he would hide at the edge of the bluff near a lake where the crows used to gather and try to call them into range of his gun with a wooden crow call. Bruce and I and Wool went with him, but we stayed out of sight in the middle of the bluff while Dad tried to get the black devils, that he called them, to come close enough to be shot. But crows are wise birds in some ways. They can recognize a gun a long way off, and some of them must have spotted Dad's shotgun. He blew and blew on his crow call, but though there were lots of them around, they all stayed a healthy distance away. Eventually, Wool got bored, and the first thing I knew, he had walked right out into the open and climbed up on a fence post. The crow call hadn't worked, but Wool sure did. As soon as they saw him, the crows forgot all about being cautious, and about my father's gun. They gathered in the clouds and began diving at Wool. Dad couldn't miss. His shotgun banged so steadily it began to sound as if a war had started. After each shot, the surviving crows would climb out of range, and then Wool would begin flapping his wings and hooting insults at them, and they would forget about the gun again. The war with the crows lasted until Dad was out of ammunition. By then, there were a lot fewer crows around Dundurn. When we got back to camp, I was telling Mother about it, beginning with the way Wool had accidentally wandered out into the open. "Wandered out?" my father interrupted. "Don't you believe it. Wool knew what he was doing." And come to think of it, Dad was probably right. Chapter 11. The spring when Weeps and Wool became 3 years old was a very sad spring for me. My father had taken a new job, so we had to leave Saskatoon and go east to the big Ontario city of Toronto. There would be no more slows, no gophers, no bluffs, and worst of all, no prairies in Toronto. I hated the idea of moving, but most of all I hated leaving my friends behind me, both my human and my animal friends. We couldn't take Weeps and Wool because they would have to spend all their days locked up in a cage, and that would have been cruel. On the other hand, we couldn't just turn them loose either because they had been members of a human family for so long they wouldn't have been able to look out for themselves. All we could do was try to find someone who would give them a new home. I talked to most of my chums about this, and they all said they were willing to take my owls, but their parents wouldn't hear of it. Then one day, I thought of Bruce. He and his family had moved away from Saskatoon a while earlier and were running a fox farm about 200 miles up to the northwest. I sat down and wrote Bruce a letter, and a few days later I got this reply. "Dear Billy, it is pretty good here. There are lots of ducks, and we have started the fox farm and got lots of pups. Dad says sure I can have the owls. We have an old fox pen I'm fixing up to keep them, and I'm building a wood house in it to keep them warm. Rex is healthy and says hello to Mutt, and says bring Mutt up here for a visit when you come with the owls. There's a lot of Indians here, and I go to school with a lot of real Indian kids. When you come, I will take you there and you can ride some of their horses. So long, your old pal Bruce." I showed the letter to my father. "Sounds fine, Billy," he said. "What do you say we drive the owls up to Bruce's place on Friday afternoon and stay for a visit until Sunday night?" I said yes, of course, and that's what we did. It was a wonderful trip to Bruce's. The sloughs were full of water, and the water was covered with ducks resting on their way north. We saw prairie chickens dancing on the side of the road, and there were more meadowlarks and red-tailed hawks than you could shake a stick at. The owls rode with me and Mutt in the rumble seat, and they had a wonderful time. When we got to the farm, Bruce's mother had a big feed ready for us. On Saturday, Bruce took me to the Indian reservation to meet his pals. One of them, a boy about my age, named Harry Wildhawk, loaned me a cayuse, and the three of us rode all over the prairie that day, chasing coyotes and jackrabbits on horseback. On Sunday, Bruce and I stayed around the farm, and I helped him finish off the cage where Wool and Weeps would sleep the night. That was a sad business, though, and I kept wishing that Saturday could have gone on forever. Wool and Weeps didn't seem to suspect anything. I think they were having too much fun to be suspicious. Wool went off and explored the big poplar bluffs behind the fox farm, and then he walked all around among the fox cages, hooting at the foxes and daring them to start something. Weeps found his way to the meat house, where the fox food was ground up in a big mincing machine, and the hired man fed Weeps so many scraps that he could hardly walk at all. Sunday night we put the two owls in their new cage. Weeps was asleep almost before I could turn the catch on the door, but all of a sudden Wool seemed to sense that something was wrong. He gave a funny sort of hoot, and then he jumped over to the door and put his head against the wire mesh. I reached down and tickled him behind his horns for a minute, and he seemed to think things were all right again. He climbed back up onto his perch and fluffed out his feathers for the night. I said, "Goodbye, old owls. You look after each other. Someday, maybe, I'll be back." The end.